friends, welcome back, or welcome if you're new here. My name is Stacy and I am the chapter conundrum, and apparently I'm being joined by Ozzy today. We're here to discuss my favorite books of 2024 and also my most surprising books, but in a good way, of 2024. And this one just can't stand that he might not be my favorite thing ever. So, he had to get in on the action here. Yeah. You're just a baby. I know. You're the favorite. I don't think he's going to stick around for the whole video, but he might stick around for a little bit. We'll see. Yeah, you're feeling very snuggly tonight, aren't you? Very snuggly. Yeah. So before we get into my best books of the year, I want to talk about a few books that I thought were fun surprises for me. And the first one of those is Heartless Hunter by Kristen Ciccarelli. And in the UK, this is The Crimson Moth. And I think that's also the series name. Yeah, I know. You want to lick the books. So if you missed my vlog of doing a really fun gift box experience of this, I would highly recommend checking that out. So I'll link that in the cards. But even aside from the gift box experience, I had a really great time with this. I thought that this had a really fun balance between a high stakes plot and a really tense romance. And I just liked how everything pretty much went in here. My only real complaint with this was that it was written as YA and not adult, because there was a spicy scene and there was kind of like mentions of darker content in these characters' backstories. And I feel like if this had been adult, we could have just gone there with all those things and it would have been even more memorable for me. But I still had a really great time with it, and I was pleasantly surprised that I enjoyed this as much as I did. So yeah, highly recommend that one. Another book that really surprised me this year is 11/22/63 by Stephen King. Now, I have had kind of a mixed bag experience with Stephen King. I have read probably 20, give or take, novels of his, and I have only given one of them a 5-star rating. So I was pleasantly surprised when I read this that I enjoyed it as much as I did. And I'm pretty sure I ended up giving this a 4.5. This wasn't objectively perfect for me, but I was entertained and engrossed throughout the whole book, which is rare for me in King, and it's also rare when he's so wordy. Some of his shorter books even feel way more wordy than they need to be, and so I was very concerned coming into one of his chunks. But ultimately, I was very entertained throughout all of this. I did feel like if you're somebody who's going into this because you're only interested in the premise and you don't want like all the stuff on the side, then maybe you will feel like this is boring and slow paced and like get to the point already. But I enjoyed the kind of meandering bits of this and the side plot stuff in this. So it all worked out for me. Are you out of here? All right, Ozzy's out. Another book that pleasantly surprised me is Funny Story by Emily Henry. And I think before I read this one, I had read 3 of her other books, and I hadn't loved any of them. But I knew that people had said that, like, with Emily Henry, there's typically one book of hers that you love, and the other ones you either don't like or just like. And so I was pleasantly surprised that Funny Story ended up being the one that I really liked. Now, I don't think this is a perfect book. I definitely think the premise of it is very unrealistic. But I had such a great time with this and really enjoyed the characters and their backstories in this one. And I think it was mostly a surprise because if you saw my worst and most disappointing reads of the year, one of her other books ends up on that video. And that was like the one I had read prior to this one. And so I was kind of like, is she maybe not the author for me? But I was pleasantly surprised to find this one and enjoy it as much as I did. And I gave it a 4.5-star rating. The last book that I'm going to put in the most surprising category is The Boy, the Mole, the Fox, and the Horse. And I think I have this in the right order, but I'll put it on the screen. And this is something that I normally would not think of as my kind of book at all. Like, this to me is like, okay, this is cozy. People describe this as a hug in a book, and rightfully so. It definitely feels like it belongs in that category. But those kinds of things are not usually what I would consider like something I gravitate towards. Like, when I hear that a book is cozy, I'm usually like, it's probably not for me. I usually love like high stakes, tense, dark, emotional books. And so this one was a big surprise to me when I picked it up. It's mainly just like a really short illustrated book that has kind of little stories and snippets in it. And it's just really chock full of like life truths that are really comforting to hear. And somehow they're like something you wouldn't necessarily think of on your own, but when you see it through the lens of these other characters and have it kind of simplified to such a level, it really clicks with you and you're like, oh yeah, I should, kind of think more this way, or this makes total sense. Like, why do I not see myself kind of in that and give myself more grace, sort of thing. So yeah, if you're having a bad day or a bad week, this is like the perfect book to pick up for you. And I was certainly surprised by how much I enjoyed my time reading it, just because it's really not my typical kind of book. And now getting more into the books I really loved that are going to be like my top 10 of the year. I do have a couple of extra honorable mentions that didn't quite make my top 10, but that I had a really good time with. And the first one of those is Notes from the Midnight Driver by Jordan Sonnenblick. And I had read a few of his other books before, but they were all more towards middle grade, and this one is more towards young adult. And so I was a bit more surprised that this had as much emotion and depth as it did, because I was more expecting his middle grade type stuff. Also, the premise of this one just doesn't sound like something that's typically normally like, oh yeah, I want to read that. But I had been enjoying his other books and I decided to give it a go, and I'm really glad I did, because there was so much more to it than the premise. The other honorable mention I have before we get into my top 10 is In Order to Live by Yeonmi Park. And this is a nonfiction memoir of a girl who escapes from North Korea. And it is very harrowing. So it feels kind of weird to say like I really enjoyed this book, but in a way it does make sense. It fits into things I really enjoy in books, in that like the writing style for her experiences, you definitely get a sense of how she's feeling and coping with things as she's experiencing them through the writing. And the writing is not dull at all. Like, you definitely have a lot of like shocking and harrowing moments in here. And even though I knew like tidbits of her story going into this, there was still so much more to unpack. I also really liked that the physical copy had pictures of her and her family in certain moments that she references in the book. So that was really cool to see too. And I would definitely say it was a very interesting read. So now we get into my top 10. I haven't like specifically put these in a ranking order, but I will say that the last one I talk about will be like my favorite of the year. Up until that, I could kind of like wiffle waffle on a ranking for days and not decide. So just chalk it up to they're my favorites. I think it's also very hard to rank them because they're very different from each other, and they're also like really not what you would expect for me to like pick up and read and love. I definitely had this thing in 2024 where I found myself reading like other people's tastes or like other favorites or things that I had seen other people talk about, instead of like what I would typically gravitate towards for my own buzzwords or reading tastes. And so this list definitely is going to reflect that. Like, you're going to, if you know my reading taste, you're going to see things on here that are like, I would not have pegged like this for you kind of thing. But there are definitely reasons why they make the list. It just feels weird to me to like not have grimdark fantasy here, because like I didn't read any last year. Normally those would be like my all-time favorite things, and yeah, I just wasn't reading it. So I have a feeling that 2025's list is going to look very different than this, and I'm excited this year to get back into things I more gravitate towards naturally in books. But all that said, let's get into my top 10 favorite books of the year. So the first one I'm going to talk about is The Last Days of Old Sherikai by Bradley P. Bolio. And this is a novella set after the events of all 6 books in the Shattered Sands series. So this definitely spoils things that happen in book 6. This is more like following action after with like new complications kind of thing. So definitely not something I can tell you a whole lot about. But I will say that I really loved the tension and the stakes that were in here. I loved seeing the impact that the events of book 6 had on a couple of the characters, and kind of like digging into that a bit more, and just seeing them kind of like grappling with those things and how they're moving forward and how they're kind of reacting to things. It was really interesting for me, and I had a really great time revisiting this series and some of these characters for those reasons. So if you have read the Shattered Sand series, definitely don't sleep on this. And also, if you're picking up the series for the first time, definitely do not skip the novellas. I think there are 7 of them now. And I've given 3 of them 5-star ratings, and I don't even think I rated a novel in the series 5 stars. I think there was some 4.5s maybe. But yeah, the novellas are like some of my favorite parts of this universe and series. So if you are considering reading the series, do not skip them, please. The next book we're going to talk about is How to Defeat a Demon King in 10 Easy Steps by Andrew Rowe. And this is a fun short novella with an interesting premise. So essentially in this world, you have a demon king who spawns on a cycle. And after he has been around for about 100 years, a hero comes and kind of like comes to level up and then defeat him. But we're only, I think, like 30 years into this current cycle, and the Demon King has already taken over so much of this world, and our main character decides we can't afford to wait another like 70 some years for this hero to spawn. We need to deal with this Demon King now. And so she comes up with a plan of how she's going to take on the Demon King, and basically the story goes from there. So this reads a lot like it's a lit RPG story, but only inside the video game portions. Like, you're not really seeing the person playing the character, you're more just seeing like the character and kind of like the person through the character, if that makes sense at all. It was a really entertaining read for me, and I like lit RPG stories to start with generally because I am a big video game nerd. For those of you who don't know, I played several MMOs back in the day, but this book has a lot of fun inspirations from the Zelda game series, which is one of my all-time favorites. It's something I grew up with. It's something I still enjoy as an adult, like the new ones on the Switch. So combining story and book elements that I like lit RPG, with Easter eggs and inspirations from an all-time favorite game series was just like the cherry on top. This was such a fun read for me. I was entertained throughout. I really enjoyed the characters. I liked where the story went, and I definitely loved trying to guess where some of the other moments were inspired from in terms of video games. Hi, Ozzy. Hi. Next up, I'm going to talk about 2 books in the same series, but I binged them back to back, and so in a way, they almost felt like the experience of reading one book for me, especially because there isn't a time gap between them. So maybe it's cheating, but I'm going to go with it. And those are Age of Swords and Age of War by Michael J. Sullivan, books 2 and 3 in the Legends of the First Empire series. So I loved my time reading both of these, and it was kind of a surprise to me that I would grow to love some of the stuff in this series as much as I did, because book 1 here was just decent for me. But book 1 really didn't introduce you to a lot of context for things going on in the story overall. And book 2 is really where we started getting a lot more of that context, and things started making more sense in a bigger picture. I got to start having more theories about the direction of where things were going. I also finally started getting more attached to some of the characters. And it's also where I started to notice some Easter eggs for the Rhaenyra universe as a whole. So book 2 really took my enjoyment up a notch. And also book 3 had really fantastic moments that I loved. It was kind of funny because I had a couple complaints with it, but the things I loved so much that it kind of overshadowed all of those things in my brain. If you've seen my worst or most disappointing books video, you'll know that there's a later book in this series that makes that list. And I kind of already touched on that these have a lot of, things in them that I didn't necessarily expect from Michael J. Sullivan in terms of tone. After having already read Rhaenyra Revelations, like, I always kind of saw him as more of like, oh, he wants to end on a happy note, or like he's more into feel good kind of stories. But these 2 definitely had a lot of bittersweet moments and a lot of emotional moments, and I really enjoyed seeing that aspect of his writing. And I hope that in the future I get more of this kind of tone from him, where like, yeah, it's still true to him and he still definitely has like feel good happy stuff in here, but it's more kind of bittersweet in some aspects and more emotional at times. It was really fun in here to see things that were set up and like kind of played out for a long time really come to fruition. And it was just very satisfying overall to read these 2, especially back to back. Next up, we're going to talk about one that surprised me in how much I enjoyed it, because I didn't think that it would necessarily be like an all-time favorite. But I read this and I loved it. 5 stars all day. It's After I Do by Taylor Jenkins Reid. And this is her debut, which is another part of the reason it surprised me so much. And it's like one of the, I think it was her last book that I hadn't read yet. I'd read like all of her other books. And I had given her like a few 4.5 stars, maybe like one other 5-star. But for some reason, I just didn't expect to love her debut as much as I did. So this follows a couple who, after they're married, are kind of like coming to a breaking point in their relationship. They're just getting very frustrated with each other. They feel like their romance has kind of fizzled out. And so they come up with this plan where they're going to separate for a year, and then at the end of that year come back together and discuss whether they want to, continue moving forward, continue being separated, etc. And one of the things I really love in a book is emotional reactive characters that let you in on how they're feeling. And this book does that so well. So coupling that with Taylor Jenkins Reid's writing style, which I already enjoy, and also just tackling more of an unconventional premise where you're dealing with a married couple who's, coming to a breaking point and just being very frustrated with each other, definitely felt unique and fresh. The pacing of this one was also fairly even. Like, there was never kind of a dull moment for me. So all of those things played into why I had such an amazing time with this book. And I would definitely recommend it if this at all sounds interesting to you. Moving into a thriller that blew me away this year, let's talk about Razorblade Tears by S.A. Cosby. This follows two fathers, one white and one black, and their sons were married to each other, and then they were murdered. So this is kind of the story of these two dads coming together to sort of try and figure out why their sons were targeted, and the story kind of goes from there. I definitely expected with S.A. Cosby that this was going to be more in the direction of like a gritty revenge story, and that's definitely what we got, coupled with this mystery of, what led to this murder. So I had previously read an S.A. Cosby book, My Darkest Prayer, and it was his debut, and I really enjoyed that one. But this one, definitely, I can see the growth in his writing. The characters just felt so much more realistic, I think, and the story was just more gripping. The pacing was better, like just everything it was already good, but now it's up to the next level. And that just makes me even more excited to check out his other books that I still haven't read. I think some of my favorite aspects about this particular one is that it just had a really good balance of everything. Like, I just felt like the mystery was evenly paced and it was compelling. There wasn't too much description, but there was enough to where I felt like I had a sense of how surroundings kind of played into the vibe and the atmosphere. I thought his action writing was excellent. I also really loved that he had some great social commentary in here, but that it didn't feel overly heavy-handed. And overall, it was just very pulled into this story. Talking about another thriller, I absolutely had a fantastic time reading What Have You Done by Sherry LaPena. And this is a thriller that follows multiple characters in a small town where a young lady has been murdered. But it's kind of unheard of for that sort of thing to happen in this sleepy town. I think it's set in Vermont too, kind of like in the middle of nowhere maybe. But definitely the characters in this town are very rattled and shaken by this murder. And it's essentially a murder mystery story told through multiple POVs. But the reason that this one works so well for me is that Sherry LaPena really put a lot of thought and intent into the possibilities of who could have done this. She really put a lot of effort into fleshing out red herrings, making so many different solutions seem very plausible and realistic. And it left you in the reading experience kind of questioning who you thought could have done this. Like, you could have had so many theories and they all could have seemed completely like equally plausible. So it was just one of those books that I had to binge, and I loved my time reading this. It kept me on the edge of my seat until the end, and I just really enjoyed the ride of reading this one. My only feedback on this is if you do decide to pick this up, I would recommend avoiding the audiobook, specifically because there's a choice that is made for the audiobook that sort of gives something away if you think about it. I'm not going to go into more detail than that, but definitely it helps me come to conclusions about certain things that I would not have if I had read this physically or on ebook. And so I think I would have appreciated not knowing that thing. And so I'm just going to recommend avoid the audiobook on this one. But otherwise, fantastic and definitely recommend. Next up, I'm thrilled to be able to include an indie pick on this year's top 10, and that is Requiem for a Star by U.G. Gutman. And this is the novella that goes in the Dawnless Night series, so it goes along with Winds of Strife, but you don't have to have read Winds of Strife in order to fully enjoy this. And in fact, Jake actually was given an arc by U.G. Gutman, the author, and we went ahead and asked, because I had been planning to read Winds of Strife, if I could also read the arc as long as I also left a review. And U.G. Gutman actually responded and said, hey, could you have her read it before she reads Winds of Strife so I can get more feedback on how the experience of that reading order works? And so I did, and I was not lost at all, and I fully enjoyed this. He does an excellent job of catching you up on things that you need the context for, as well as including explanation pages about the magic system that help catch you up if you haven't got any context or knowledge from Winds of Strife. And this is the story of a young girl called Nova, and it's more a character-focused coming-of-age story. We get to follow her through a variety of life experiences, and she is just really fun to follow. She definitely lets you in on how she's feeling, and furthermore, she has justifications for how she's feeling and motivations behind her reactions. So it was really cool to see how fleshed out U.G. Gutman managed to get her character in such few pages. And also, I think this is such an underrated talent, but I feel like he did that with the description in the world and the magic and everything. Like, it's amazing how much was conveyed in so few words in this story. I really loved that he was able to pack in some of like her reasoning behind her decisions and reactions too, because I thought it made her even more interesting and more relatable for me too. Aside from this being entertaining and from me enjoying the character, there was just a lot of emotional depth packed into the story and meaning behind the story. If you do decide to pick this up and read it, definitely do not skip the author's note, because it adds a whole other layer to what you just read, and for me, it made me appreciate the story even more so. I can't really convey to you in words just quite how this made me feel. It's one of those things that you're probably just gonna have to experience for yourself and kind of like take your own things from it. But yeah, overall, highly recommend picking this up. It was so great. And I rarely see a book that gets me thinking and has the emotional impact that this one does. Next up, let's get into a romance that I absolutely loved last year, and that is Every Summer After by Carly Fortune. And this is particularly special for me because this author is semi-local to my hometown. So she, I think, has a cottage or has visited a cottage in the Muskoka area, which is probably like anywhere from half hour to an hour drive from my hometown area. And so I'm very familiar with the setting of this book and also just the vibe of the people. And there's also just something about picking up a Canadian author for me that feels homey. Like, I don't know if it's just our slang or the characters fitting into our culture a little bit more or what it is, but definitely I've noticed this trend with several Canadian authors, and I definitely remember feeling that sense of like hominess with this one. So this is a second chance romance that follows Persephone and Sam, and they are two kids whose families had neighboring cottages on Barry's Bay, and they spent a lot of time over the summers together growing up, and you really get to see their friendship kind of slowly grow and develop. And then you also see in the past timeline their romance sort of develop, and then some decisions are made and things kind of fall apart, and then they've kind of become estranged, but present day events are bringing them sort of back in the same proximity, and it's really a second chance romance for them. So normally second chance romances don't work all that well for me, but this particular one was fantastic because you really got to see the development that they had in the first place that really brought them together the first time. But then you also, on top of that, got it alongside this kind of mysterious question in the back of your head, like, okay, well, what happened to these characters? Why are they in the position they're in now? And so it was kind of a multifaceted, layered experience. I just had a really good time reading it, between the homey vibes familiar setting, characters that I enjoyed, and a layered story. It worked for me on so many levels. And I think it also was kind of a bonus surprise because this was her debut novel, and I had originally read her second novel and I liked it. So I was kind of going into this thinking, okay, well, I'll probably like it. I may not love it, but hey, I'm supporting a local author and it's fun to just kind of have those homey vibes. But no, this blew me away and I loved it. So I would highly recommend if any of that sounds interesting to you. Next up, I have I'm Glad My Mom Died by Jeanette McCurdy. And this, to me, I didn't necessarily expect to be here. Like, I generally don't read a ton of nonfiction, and when I do, it's typically not like an all-time favorite book. But this one took me on a ride for sure, and it does make sense in hindsight because it does play into several things that I really enjoy about books. One of the things I love is an emotional, reactive character who's letting you in on how they're feeling and kind of telling you the deeper side of their experience. And definitely Jeanette McCurdy is very good at reflecting on the emotions she had behind her experiences as she's telling them to you. I definitely felt that the writing style in this memoir was very easy to connect to, and it was very excellent for me. Also, just the pacing of her writing is great. And I also love when an author manages to change your perspective on something as you read. And I also just love unpacking a character's motivation, especially when it seems like it's something that is counterintuitive or like confusing to you at first. And so having a title like I'm Glad My Mom Died really makes you, or at least makes me, want to unpack like, okay, but why does she feel this way? Like, what events have led up to this culmination of this feeling, right? And so I definitely enjoyed the ride of reading this for all of those reasons. And now my favorite book of 2024 was actually one that was part of a read-along on the Discord. So kind of redemption for all the nuggety thrill, chill, or kill books that I had to read last year if you saw my worst books video. This one was part of one of the fantasy read-alongs though, and that is going to be The Broken Eye by Brent Weeks. This is the third Lightbringer book. And this was really satisfying for me in particular because I had previously read book 1 and 2 in the series, and my buddy that I was reading it with ended up like moving overseas and kind of fell off reading fantasy after that. So I had stopped reading the series even though I was really enjoying it. And this year I finally decided, okay, I'm going to go back. I'm going to reread books 1 and 2. I'm going to finish the series. And we ended up making it a read along. So it was really fun to be able to get to dig into more of my thoughts and theories and catch on to even more detail and foreshadowing throughout book 1 and 2 in my reread. But then in book 3, we really kind of took it up a notch and we finally got some of the answers that I have been desperately hoping for. And this is also the installment in the series where I really started to get even more attached to some of the characters and also get intrigued by some of the characters. But mainly I just really enjoyed that some of the theories I had from earlier books were finally, satisfied and answered. And also something else I really love in a book is a compelling villain, especially one that just like irks you and that they're usually like manipulative, but they have like a way about them that just gets under my skin. And definitely this series has a villain like that, and they were in full form in book 3. So this was just top notch for me. I had a wonderful time reading it, and sadly I thought that the series kind of went downhill after this installment, so I'm kind of a little torn on the series as a whole. But this particular book definitely holds a special place in my heart in my reading journey of 2024, and I had such a fantastic time reading and chatting about it with everyone. So that was it for the best books I read in 2024, as well as some books that surprised me and some honorable mentions. Let me know down below in the comments what were your favorite books of last year, and also let me know, have you read any of the books I mentioned on today's video, and what did you think of them when you read them? 2025, I'm getting back to things I normally gravitate towards a lot more. There will be grimdark on next year's list, I promise. Thank you guys so much for watching. Don't forget to hit like and subscribe on your way out if you want to, and have a fantastic day. Bye!